Something extraordinary is unfolding across the world's oceans. And very few people, even in the United States, understand the scale of what's happening. For 70 years, the U.S. Navy has been the undisputed master of global waters, its aircraft carriers standing as floating symbols of unmatched American power. These massive vessels have shaped diplomacy, influenced conflicts, and projected U.S. authority into every corner of the globe. But that era is fading, and what is emerging in its place should concern anyone who cares about global stability, international order, and America's future. China is not trying to imitate our naval model. They are building something fundamentally different, something designed to turn our greatest strength into a critical weakness. They are building coordinated naval swarms, networks of 40 or more warships operating in precise unison, all armed with hypersonic missiles that travel so fast our defenses were never designed to stop them. This isn't speculation or futuristic fantasy. It's the backbone of China's modern naval doctrine, and it represents a profound shift in how wars at sea could be fought. The question is no longer whether one American carrier can survive such an attack. The real question is whether we're willing to accept that the global balance of power has changed, and whether American leaders have the strategic clarity needed to adapt before events force their hand. What comes next will shape not just America's position in the world, but the likelihood of a devastating conflict that neither nation wants, yet both are quietly preparing for. Let's begin with a hard truth, one that will make many uncomfortable but must be stated clearly. For 30 years, the United States has operated under a flawed understanding of military power. Nowhere is this more evident than in our assumptions about naval dominance. We became so confident in our post-Cold War superiority, so certain of our technological edge, that we ignored the slow but undeniable shift happening beneath us. And I mean this literally. The balance of naval power has changed in ways that carry enormous consequences for regional security, American foreign policy, and the very real possibility of a catastrophic confrontation in the Western Pacific. When we discuss the image of 40 Chinese warships facing an American aircraft carrier, we're not describing some theoretical scenario cooked up by academics. We're describing a situation that Chinese naval strategists have been planning, practicing, and perfecting for over 20 years. This isn't about China trying to match American strength ship for ship. It's about China recognizing it can't beat American carriers by building carriers of its own. Instead, it chose the smarter, more asymmetric path: build weapons specifically designed to neutralize the United States' most powerful asset. This is asymmetric warfare, executed at the highest strategic level, a shift comparable to the moment aircraft carriers themselves made battleships obsolete. To understand the implications, we first need clarity about what an American aircraft carrier truly is. A Nimitz-class or Ford-class carrier is not merely a ship. It is a floating air base, a mobile city, a strategic tool capable of projecting unmatched military force thousands of miles from home. These vessels cost more than $13 billion to build, require crews of over 5,000 people, and operate at the center of carrier strike groups that include cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and support ships. Altogether, a single strike group represents around $50 billion of hardware and decades of doctrine and experience. For three-quarters of a century, these formations have sailed the world essentially unchallenged, delivering American power wherever needed. But that assumption of invulnerability no longer holds. What changed is simple to describe, but enormous in consequence. Beginning in the late 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s, China began pouring vast resources into what its strategists call anti-access and area denial capabilities. The idea behind this strategy is both elegant and devastating. If you cannot project power like the United States, then make sure the United States cannot project power into your region. The foundation of this approach is a series of increasingly advanced anti-ship missile systems technology explicitly engineered to threaten, disable, or destroy American carriers. And the more you study these systems, the more you understand why naval experts around the world see this as a defining shift in maritime warfare. China has deployed multiple families of ballistic and cruise missiles built specifically to strike large naval targets. The DF-21D, often labeled by Western analysts as the carrier killer, can reach more than 900 miles. The DF-26 can strike nearly 2,000 meters away, allowing Chinese forces to target carriers long before they approach the coast. But the most concerning development is the rise of hypersonic technology missiles that travel at speeds above Mach 5 and follow unpredictable trajectories that render traditional missile defenses unreliable. These systems are designed with one purpose: to exploit every vulnerability in the U.S. Navy's most valuable platforms. Now, consider what happens when these missile systems are paired with a fleet of 40 warships operating in coordinated formation. This is where the scenario becomes not just challenging, but potentially overwhelming. China has been building ships at a pace unlike anything seen in modern naval history. Over the past decade and a half, they have launched more vessels than the entire active fleets of many European nations combined. And these are not basic or inferior platforms. China is producing modern destroyers, frigates, and corvettes equipped with advanced radar arrays, electronic warfare capabilities, and vertical launch systems carrying dozens of missiles. When 40 of these vessels operate together, supported by land-based aircraft, submarines, surveillance drones, and missile batteries along the Chinese coastline, they create a layered defense network with overlapping targeting systems. This network offers redundant surveillance, multiple lines of attack, and synchronized missile salvos. In strategic terms, it's not a fair fight. It's not designed to be. It is designed to saturate American defenses beyond their operational limits. It is engineered to force American commanders into a series of impossible decisions. To understand the scale of that challenge, we must be realistic about what an American carrier strike group can and cannot do. Its defensive capabilities are formidable. Aegis-equipped cruisers and destroyers can track and engage hundreds of targets at once. The Navy's interceptors, Standard missiles, and others have proven highly effective against aircraft and certain types of incoming missiles. But even the most advanced defensive system can be overwhelmed through saturation, and that is precisely the threat China's doctrine is built around. If 40 Chinese vessels launch even a modest number of missiles simultaneously, the carrier group could face hundreds of incoming threats approaching from multiple directions. Add hypersonic missiles too fast for reliable interception. Add submarine-launched torpedoes approaching from beneath the surface. Add electronic warfare systems designed to blind or confuse American radar. Under these conditions, the carrier group might still shoot down most incoming weapons, perhaps 70, 80, or even 90%. But in this kind of engagement, success isn't measured by percentages. One or two missiles slipping through the shield can mission kill a carrier, disable its flight deck, or inflict catastrophic damage. A single successful strike could cost thousands of American lives and neutralize a $15 billion asset within minutes. This isn't simply a tactical problem, it's a strategic and political dilemma with human consequences. Each carrier carries more than 5,000 men and women, each with families waiting at home. The loss of a carrier would be the most devastating moment in American naval history since World War II, not only militarily, but politically, socially, and psychologically. The shock would reshape American attitudes toward foreign policy and defense for decades. And this brings us to a truth that often gets overlooked in technical discussions about missiles and naval doctrine. Behind every theoretical scenario are real human beings: sailors, pilots, engineers, commanders whose lives would be placed directly in harm's way. An aircraft carrier is not just a strategic asset, it is a community of more than 5,000 people, each one vulnerable if the vessel comes under concentrated attack. The sinking or crippling of such a ship would not only be a military disaster, it would be a national trauma. The political shockwave across the United States would be immense, forcing every citizen and policymaker to reconsider assumptions about American power and global leadership, and the consequences would reach far beyond the immediate battlefield. Both American and Chinese planners fully understand this reality. That is precisely why any confrontation between these forces carries an inherent risk of rapid and uncontrollable escalation. Imagine a scenario in which the United States believes China is preparing to launch such a strike. The pressure to act first to eliminate the threat before it materializes would be extraordinarily high. Likewise, if China believed the United States was planning a preemptive attack, the incentive for China to strike first would grow just as strong. This creates a classic security dilemma, one where both sides see defensive actions as potentially offensive and both risk making catastrophic decisions based on fear of what the other might do. The danger here exceeds what we faced during the Cold War. Back then, the US and the Soviet Union were locked in a global ideological struggle, but their militaries were separated by geography and had mechanisms to manage crisis. Today, advanced surveillance, long-range missiles, and hyperspeed weapons compress decision times. Misunderstandings can escalate in minutes, not hours. And unlike the Soviet Union, China's forces are operating near their home territory, which gives them a natural advantage in surveillance, coordination, and rapid response. At this point, some people ask whether the entire scenario is exaggerated, whether analysts are inflating threats or imagining worst-case outcomes. But the uncomfortable truth is that Chinese military doctrine explicitly prepares for exactly this kind of engagement. It is not conjecture. It is published in official documents, demonstrated in training exercises, and reflected in weapons procurement. China has built sensor networks to detect U.S. carriers at long range. They have developed command and control systems that can coordinate complex multi-vector strikes, and they regularly rehearse these operations. The United States is well aware of this. Countless war games, classified studies, and simulations have modeled the opening stages of a conflict over Taiwan or the South China Sea. The results of many of these simulations are sobering. In a large number of scenarios, American forces suffer significant losses early in the conflict, including the potential loss of one or more carriers. Now, simulations are not destiny. Many variables cannot be captured perfectly, and real-world conflict is full of surprises. But even with that caveat, the message is clear. U.S. naval dominance in the Western Pacific is not what it was 20 or 30 years ago, and anyone pretending otherwise is ignoring reality. And this reality leads us to deeper questions, questions that extend far beyond missiles and naval formations. For decades, the United States has made security commitments throughout the Asia-Pacific region. We've pledged to defend Japan. We've implied we might defend Taiwan. We've routinely asserted our right to navigate disputed waters in the South China Sea. All of these commitments depend on one critical assumption, that the United States can project credible military power into the region if necessary. But if American carriers cannot survive long enough to operate effectively in a high-intensity conflict, what happens to those commitments? What happens to our alliances? And what happens to the stability of a region that has relied on American power for more than 70 years? These questions are not theoretical. They form the heart of a geopolitical challenge that could define the next century. To understand the stakes, consider one of the most sensitive flashpoints on Earth, Taiwan. This island of 24 million people is a thriving democracy and a technological powerhouse, producing more than half of the world's advanced semiconductors. These chips power everything: smartphones, cars, medical equipment, satellites, data centers, and cutting-edge weapons. If China were to seize Taiwan by force or coercion, the global economic shock would be immediate and severe. The geopolitical consequences would be even greater, reshaping the balance of power in Asia and signaling to the world that American security guarantees may no longer be reliable. But here lies the brutal dilemma American leaders may face in the coming years. Is the United States willing to risk losing an aircraft carrier and the 5,000 lives on board to defend Taiwan? Are we willing to accept the possibility of nuclear escalation with a major power over an island thousands of miles away? These are not moral questions, though morality plays a role. These are questions of political survival, strategic calculation, and public acceptance. And the more important question is, what does China believe the U.S. answer will be? If Chinese leaders conclude that the United States will not risk catastrophic losses, they may feel emboldened to act before the military balance shifts again. This is what makes the situation so dangerous. We are not simply dealing with military assets and strategic doctrines, but with perceptions, assumptions, and calculations made behind closed doors in Washington and Beijing. To grasp the full context, we must zoom out and look at the transformation unfolding in the international system. The United States emerged from the Cold War as the world's sole superpower, able to project military force anywhere on the globe. This unipolar moment shaped American foreign policy for decades, giving Washington a sense of freedom and confidence rarely seen in world history. But power is always relative. And while the United States remained strong, China rose at unprecedented speed. In 2000, China's economy was about 1/10 the size of the American economy. Today, depending on how you measure it, China's economy is roughly 3/4 the size of ours and has surpassed us in several industrial and technological sectors. This economic rise funded massive investments in infrastructure, technology, and military modernization. China didn't build these capabilities out of malice. Rising powers throughout history have done the same. They accumulate wealth, expand influence, and develop the military tools they believe are necessary to protect their interests. The problem emerges when the interests of a rising power collide with those of an established one. And in the Western Pacific, that is exactly what has happened. Both nations believe they have vital stakes in the region. Both are investing heavily in military systems optimized for conflict with each other, and both face domestic political pressures that make compromise difficult and backing down even harder. The tragedy of this moment is that a war between the United States and China would be catastrophic for both countries and for the world. There would be no victors, only different degrees of devastation. The economic consequences alone would trigger a global depression far worse than 2008. Supply chains would collapse, energy markets would convulse, global trade, much of which flows through Asia, would grind to a halt. And if the conflict escalated beyond conventional forces, the nuclear risks would be horrific. Yet despite these monumental dangers, both nations are building the weapons, refining the doctrines, and maintaining the commitments that could make such a war increasingly likely. It is a paradox at the heart of great power rivalry. The very action states take to protect themselves can push them closer to disaster. This is why the question of American carriers facing 40 Chinese warships is not a narrow technical issue. It is a symptom of a much deeper strategic problem, a problem that has no simple solution but demands clear thinking and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. So the question becomes, what can the United States do? How should we respond to a shifting balance of power? that challenges decades of strategic assumptions. This is where I diverge from many voices within the American foreign policy establishment because I believe the current trajectory, building more weapons, strengthening alliances aimed at containing China, and doubling down on commitments that may no longer be militarily credible, is a path toward confrontation, not stability. It is a strategy designed for a world that no longer exists, a world in which American forces could operate with near total freedom. Instead, we need a fundamentally new approach, one built around diplomacy, crisis management, and realistic assessments of our capabilities. This doesn't mean surrendering American interests or abandoning long-standing partners. It means recognizing that the most dangerous conflicts in history weren't caused by deliberate aggression, but by misperceptions, rigid commitments, and leaders boxed in by domestic expectations. To avoid repeating those tragedies, the United States must acknowledge that China has legitimate security interests in its own region, just as we do in ours. This doesn't mean agreeing with China's claims or tolerating coercion, but it does mean understanding why China is behaving the way it is. The same strategic logic that led the United States to dominate the Western Hemisphere naturally drives China to seek influence in the Western Pacific. Ignoring this reality has pushed both nations into a collision course neither truly wants. A more stable future begins with communication, not vague diplomatic statements, but clear structured mechanisms designed to prevent escalation. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union established hotlines, crisis protocols, arms control agreements, and mutually understood red lines. These tools didn't eliminate competition or mistrust, but they created guardrails that prevented misunderstandings from spiraling into nuclear war. In the US-China relationship, those guardrails largely do not exist. And in a world of hypersonic weapons and compressed decision times, the absence of such mechanisms is a recipe for disaster. However, diplomacy does not work without realism. The United States must also reassess its security commitments in ways that reflect the changing military balance. This does not mean abandoning Taiwan, Japan, or other partners. It means ensuring that our promises align with our capabilities. Empty commitments are more dangerous than no commitments at all because they give allies false confidence and adversaries false assumptions about American resolve. We must also recognize that allies themselves have agency. Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and others in the region are not passive bystanders. They have their own interests, their own fears, and their own calculations about China's rise. Some may choose to balance against China, others may seek accommodation, but none should be forced into an all or nothing choice between Beijing and Washington, a choice that would only heighten regional tensions. At the same time, China must be pressed to accept that its neighbors have legitimate security needs. Any attempt by China to coerce Taiwan, intimidate Japan, or dominate the South China Sea will inevitably provoke counterbalancing coalitions. Even nations that want strong trade ties with China cannot accept a future where Beijing dictates the rules of the region. This dynamic is already visible. India, Australia, Japan, Vietnam, and other states have grown increasingly wary of China's assertiveness. The more China pushes, the more opposition it generates. This is why both Washington and Beijing must invest as much effort in diplomacy as they have invested in weapon systems. Crisis communication, military transparency, coordinated maritime rules, and arms control discussions should be treated as seriously as new destroyers or missile batteries. The alternative is a world in which two nuclear-armed superpowers drift toward confrontation without a shared understanding of each other's intentions. An environment far more dangerous than the Cold War, Because if we stay on the current path, the question of whether an American carrier can survive a coordinated Chinese strike becomes not a theoretical debate, but a real world test. One that could kill thousands, sink nations into depression, and push the world into the most destructive conflict of the 21st century. If we continue drifting without a new strategy, the situation in the Pacific could ultimately collapse into the kind of crisis that neither nation can control. In that moment, all the theories, simulations, and debates about carrier survivability would give way to reality. Real ships, real missiles, and real people caught in the middle of a disaster decades in the making. And once such a conflict begins, the logic of escalation becomes incredibly difficult to resist. A torpedo strike leads to a missile barrage. A damaged carrier leads to retaliatory attacks on coastal bases. Each side interprets its own actions as defensive and the others as aggressive. Both believe they must hit harder to avoid defeat. Within days, perhaps hours, the conflict could expand far beyond its initial spark. This is how great powers stumble into wars that neither side wants, yet both sides feel compelled to fight. It has happened before. History is full of moments when leaders understood the risks, but were trapped by alliances, fears, or the belief that failing to act would be more dangerous than going to war. The years before World War I offer a haunting example. European nations built massive armies designed for rapid mobilization and decisive conflict. They formed rigid alliance structures that promised mutual aid in the event of even a small crisis. When a regional dispute erupted, those commitments activated like a row of falling dominoes, pulling entire nations into a catastrophic war. No leader wanted such a conflict, yet they all felt powerless to stop it. Once events gained momentum, millions died, empires collapsed, and the world was reshaped for generations. The technology today is different, but the underlying dynamics are tragically familiar. Fear, miscalculation, national pride, domestic politics, these forces shape state behavior as powerfully now as they did a century ago. The scenario of 40 Chinese warships facing an American aircraft carrier captures only one part of this larger reality. It symbolizes a deeper strategic failure, the inability of two great powers to find a stable way to coexist in a world where their interests overlap and sometimes collide. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union avoided direct conflict through deterrence, communication, and ultimately the internal collapse of one rival. But China is not the Soviet Union. Its economy is vibrant and globally integrated. It does not seek to export an ideology or overthrow governments worldwide. Thanks for watching. Your support means everything. Please like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more important updates coming your way.